Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jen Baca, Director of Business Development at AtlanticLIVE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. I hope you're enjoying the Atlantic Festival so far. We've still got a lot more for you. Today, we're going to explore the global economy and the leading thinkers who have shaped the course of fiscal policy. Economists weren't always revered, but today they are, by some measures, responsible for the state of our bank accounts, our retirement savings, our mortgages, and all those goods we buy from China. That, as well as our stagnant wages and vast income inequality. In this session, we'll explore our economic history and how that affects today's economy. But before we begin, please silence your cell phones, but keep them handy to tweet using the hashtag #TheAtlanticFest. And we'll be taking questions today, so be ready. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Binyamin Appelbaum, who has covered the economy and fiscal policy for the New York Times and is a member of their editorial board. He's the author of the just-released book, The Economists Hour, False Prophets, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society. He's joined by Atlantic senior editor Yoni Appelbaum, who also happens to be his brother. Thank you, Yoni.
Thanks, Jen. I'm grateful to The Atlantic for giving me the opportunity to roast my older brother on stage. That's not something that comes along very often, and I intend to take full advantage of it. This is a book which I was morally obliged to read, but I'm happy to report that I couldn't put it down. It's a fascinating account. The thing that puzzled me most was the title, probably. And I'm pleased finally to know that the Economist's Hour is between 12:30 and 1:30 on a Thursday afternoon. The book starts in a funny place, which is an America not dominated by economists. And I think until I opened it up and read, I'd never stopped to think about how thoroughly, pervasively economic thinking has come to dominate our public policy debates, and to wonder exactly when and where that came to be. So maybe the place to start is to think, you spent many years covering the Federal Reserve, the New York Times. What was the Federal Reserve like 50 years ago?
So I begin the book with the story of a young economist working in the bowels of the Federal Reserve in the early 1950s. He's essentially in charge of doing calculations for the people who actually make the decisions at the Fed, none of whom are economists. There's an Iowa hog farmer on the Fed's board at that time, a bunch of bankers, financial market types, but no economists. And he comes home one night and tells his wife that he doesn't see any future for himself at the Fed. He can't imagine an economist having a successful career at that institution. And he's not wrong. The head of the Fed at the time is a guy named William McChesney Martin. Martin tells a visitor that, yeah, the Fed has a couple of economists, but he keeps them in the basement because they ask good questions, but they don't know their own limitations. And that's the Fed in the early 1950s. Well, that young man was named Paul Volcker, and by the end of the 1970s, he's running the place. So there's this incredible transition in the role of economists in American society.
So that was a revelation to me. The Fed board is now almost wholly, entirely comprised of economists?
Well, the chairman, Jay Powell, is not an economist, but for the last half century, essentially, it has been run by economists, and it is actually the largest employer of economists in the United States. And so, it is now an institution dominated by that discipline.
And it sort of went forward from there to a blind economist named Walter Oy, and to the draft, which was not a topic I expected in a book on economics. Why did you choose to focus on the military draft?
Yeah, the book is basically the history of a revolution that begins in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, where economists come to be increasingly influential in shaping American policy. And the first place that they have that influence is really quite a surprising one, which is that economists are enormously important in ending the draft, in ending military conscription in the United States. This always surprises people when I tell them. Well, maybe less so as I talk more about it, but it used to surprise people before I wrote a book about it. And the way the story goes is Richard Nixon knows that the draft is increasingly unpopular. So after World War II, every year the American government taps tens of thousands of young men on the shoulder and says, you need to serve for 2 years in the military, and that's how we fill out the ranks of the military. By the mid-1960s, a couple things are going on. First off, the baby boom means that a smaller and smaller share of the population is needed just to meet the military's manpower requirements. There's also an unpopular war in Southeast Asia. And the military itself is starting to wonder about the value of having people for 2 years. Equipment is getting increasingly complicated. Training costs are very significant. They'd rather keep soldiers around for longer. But no one is quite sure what to do about it. And the alternative that's proposed by Milton Friedman initially, who's really the most important figure in this revolution, is that the government should start paying soldiers more money, and that it should pay them enough money that it can hire enough soldiers to fill out the ranks of the military. So Sergeant Elvis Presley should be allowed to focus on his singing career, because he can make more money doing that and everyone will be better off. And someone else can be hired to serve in his place. And in that way, you'll get a more efficient, more effective armed force. And this idea is pitched to Richard Nixon, who's gearing up to run in the 1968 election, and he likes it, and he embraces it.
It's a little expensive, though.
It is expensive. It's a little bit more expensive. And so this is where we get to Walter Oy, who's an amazing figure. Oy went blind during graduate school, but still completed his doctorate and became an academic economist who would do his work by dictating equations to his wife and a couple of specially trained assistants who would perform the calculations for him. He had an incredible memory. And he built a career as an academic economist and came to specialize in this question of military conscription and wrote the papers that proved to the Nixon administration that it was possible to move to a volunteer force. And so the Nixon administration ultimately embraces that case, stops drafting young men in 1973. There's inevitably one last guy who serves for 16 months and then tells the New York Times that he hated every minute of it. And that's the end of it. To this day, no one else has been conscripted.
One thing that jumped out at me in this recounting was the way that the problem was framed. The draft conscription had been debated for a long time. You can see it as a matter of equity and social fairness, right? Everybody should shoulder an equal burden. And in fact, when the draft had been put in place at various points in American history, it was often framed in precisely that way. You can see it as a matter of efficiency, which is how this debate was framed. And you can see it also as a matter of opportunity cost, right? And this was part of what Walter Oy was doing, was reframing the way we think about public policy problems, which particular challenges should we put in the foreground and which necessarily recede as we focus on this.
And also the way that we think about the role of government, because government had sort of claimed this role of deciding who should serve and claimed to be doing it in a way that was good for society. So there were exclusions for, doctors who were in demand, or, the state of Wisconsin for a while exempted anybody who could fix a tractor because they had a shortage of farm mechanics. And so the government was sort of playing this role of administering the economy, of making decisions about who should be serving and who should be doing other things with their lives. And what Oy and Friedman are arguing, and what the government ultimately embraces, is the premise that you should let market forces sort all of that out. That you should just put a price on military service and let people decide whether they want to do it at that price.
The other thing I took away from this discussion was that pretty much everybody was wrong in their projections about what was going to happen next. You've got the advocates of this saying that this is a great way to avoid wars. Once you're actually having to employ the soldiers, that there'll be greater breaks on the use of military force. You've got critics saying you'd get the very dregs of society. People who can't find any other kind of employment and are unqualified to be in the military are the only ones who will take this job. And they're all wrong.
Yeah, this session is billed as forecasting the future. One thing that I would say to you is that economists are terrible at forecasting the future. So is everyone else, but economists are paid to do it, so there probably is a bigger problem there. But that's right, everyone's wrong, and what ends up happening is basically that we get a better quality of soldier over time, a more efficient fighting force, but we also turn war into a line of business, and so it becomes easier for us to sustain endless wars on a small scale, because most Americans can simply ignore it or take the position that the people who are doing it volunteered and are being paid, and it's just another line of business for the American government. So it's an illustration of how market forces change not just who ends up serving, but how we use military force.
Before we zoom back a little bit, I want to dive into another episode in the book that pushes us in a slightly different direction. And this is the story of a horrifying car crash that involves the Hollywood actress Jane Mansfield, who is decapitated as a car slides under a truck. And the government's decision not to require a safety upgrade on trucks, and how that decision gets made. So walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so Mansfield dies outside of New Orleans in a fog of anti-mosquito haze when her car goes sliding under a truck. And in the wake of that accident, because we care more about the deaths of celebrities, the government decides to figure out how to prevent such deaths in the future. And the conclusion that's reached is that you can do it by dropping a bar behind the tail of trucks. And there's a proposal to make every truck in the country get this kind of bar. So the government at that time is beginning to grapple with a really important question, which is how do you decide which regulations are worth it? This is an era in which the government is becoming much more active in regulation. Really, until the mid-60s, the government is not active in health and safety regulation or consumer product regulation. But Ralph Nader really plays a large role in changing that, arguing that really a primary role of government should be protecting people from the products that they use. And so the government in the early 70s is for the first time writing car safety rules. And initially, the law itself actually says, figure out what will keep people safe and make the car companies do it. But pretty quickly, people start wondering, well, is everything worthwhile? Should we require them to spend? We're going to make cars a lot more expensive if we do everything that's possible. How do we decide what is worthwhile and what is not? And what the government does is it starts hiring economists to perform what are called cost-benefit analyses, trying to quantify the benefits, the costs in the first place, which are fairly straightforward, of requiring cars to adopt a particular safety feature. But then what's more difficult is to assess the benefits of saving lives. And the key question is, how much is a human life worth? And this becomes the core debate. And one of the early conclusions about this at the time, the government basically goes and it asks life insurance companies how much a life is worth. You may note that most people, even if they have a life insurance policy, would rather stay alive. So this is probably a low-end value on human life. But that's the figure they use. It's the only one they have. And they conclude on that basis that it's definitely not worth the cost of installing these bars underneath trucks.
But if a truck stops in front of you on the highway today, and you crash into the back of it, you will not slide under that truck.
Yeah, and that's because of what's actually called a Mansfield bar, which the government finally requires trucks to start installing in the 1990s.
And what changes the government regulators' minds about the utility of this bar?
So this is really what is fascinating to me, is that initially opponents of the rise of economists in government just argued that you shouldn't. It's literally the position of, for example, the AFL-CIO for years, that you just should not put a price on life, that it's wrong to do that. But that leaves the field to the people who are doing it anyway, because you do need to make these decisions. And so for years, the government puts a very low value on human life, and lots of safety measures are excluded on the grounds that they're not cost effective. Well, it's really the Clinton administration that finally says, even us liberals are going to get into the business of putting a value on life. That's the playing field. We need to engage with it. We're just going to put a higher value on human life. And they do that, and they justify a higher value. And the Transportation Department takes that higher number, literally a higher assessment of what human life is worth, and does the calculations over again. And now it turns out that the Mansfield bar is worthwhile. And so they require trucks to put it on. And today you can't slide under a truck anymore.
So it's the same number of lives. There's no actual shift in the benefit that the safety improvement is delivering, but a different assessment, not of the cost of implementation, but of how high a value we ought to set on human life itself.
Yeah, both sides get their own economists, and now they're fighting their political battles by other means.
So this is the culmination of the revolution, right? When even those who have been out there resisting the logic of the revolution, even those who have denigrated economic thinking, who have pushed for other kinds of measures of public policy, are now adopting the toolkit of economists and using that toolkit in order to contest the calculations that economists on the other side of the aisle are making.
Yeah, and the guy who really leads this revolution is an economist named Kip Viscusi, who convinces Democrats to take cost-benefit analysis seriously. What he says to them is, he says, listen, I'm an environmentalist too. I care about children's lives too. Until you put a dollar figure on that stuff, you are going to keep on losing these fights. And that, as you say, is sort of, it's a capitulation to the methodology. It says, We need to accept that economists are going to be the arbiters of these decisions. We need to participate in the process, and we need to try to get the best possible outcome. And we can talk about some of the consequences of that. It's not an unmitigated good thing by any means. It has real limitations as a methodology, but it does mean that both sides are now using the same rules and that those rules are written by economists.
So one of the things that I took away from this, you'd done a lot of reporting. You'd gone to Chile, to Taiwan. You talked to a lot of American economists to watch how public policy plays out in the real world, how economic thinking gets translated into those policies, and then how those policies play out. And if there's one theme of this book, I think the answer to that question is not as anyone expected, that all of the predictions are delivered with great confidence, and only very rarely do the results measure up. Why is that? Why is it so hard for economists to create models that when you look back at them 10 or 20 years later, and are they getting better at it as time goes by?
I mean, the world is a really complicated place, and economics is sort of, it was originally called political economy. It's inherently the art of acting on public policy, which is an extremely complex space. And it's just not science. And the consequence is that when you're trying to model the real world and to change some of the parameters and to anticipate the results, that's really hard to do. And so in a sense, I think one asks too much of economists when one expects them to make accurate predictions about the future. But I think another lesson is that directionally, economists often do get what they want. So, when they are pushing for, cost-benefit analysis, while they may not correctly anticipate all the consequences, they do succeed in actually forcing policymaking in that direction. When they are emphasizing economic growth or de-emphasizing the importance of equality, they succeed in pushing policy in that direction too. So they may not accurately anticipate all of the contours or consequences, but there is a clear connection between policy and outcome.
So one thing you screwed up in the book, among the many things you screwed up, is that Americans like their narratives to have villains and heroes, and instead you gave us people, which is just a lot less satisfying.
I knew there was a reason we hadn't done this before.
The economists here are not villains. They're trying to formulate public policy, and they're struggling to do it. And they're delivering concrete benefits with things like airline deregulation, for example. It's a heck of a lot cheaper, maybe not as pleasant, but a heck of a lot cheaper to fly across the United States now than it was 50 years ago, right?
And we fly about 8 times as often as people in 1960, so we're voting with our feet.
There's a wonderful scene in this book where the man pushing through airline deregulation gets a letter from an irate senator who would like to complain about the quality of the service that deregulation has produced.
Yeah, Barry Goldwater is flying home to Arizona, and he writes this new federal regulator and says, service has gotten terrible. There's people sitting on both sides of me. I have no elbow room. And the Economist writes back and says, I would encourage you to refer to the writings of Barry Goldwater on the importance of a free market. This is what reality looks like now. You got what you wanted. Congratulations. Yeah.
But as they're delivering these very real benefits, and in almost every chapter we see that there are gains from this kind of thinking, they're also setting up some very real problems. What would you say are the liabilities of the Economists Hour? If over the last 50 years economic thinking has reshaped American public policy, delivered some very concrete gains, where has it fallen short?
So I think there's 3 things, and I think of it as a story of a revolution that went too far. There were important benefits to this shift, and then it kept going. The first is that we didn't get broad prosperity. That was the promise, is that if we would place markets at the center of public policy, markets and the economy would work better for us. And that simply hasn't happened. Per capita growth in the United States has declined in each decade since the 1960s. We may be up a little bit at the end of the current decade, but only because the last one was so very lousy. And so this promise that the economy would do better hasn't turned out. Even more important than that, in my view, is that the distribution of growth has become increasingly lopsided. So most Americans probably know that we've grown faster than the French economy, and a lot of people take a lot of pride in that. They think of it as a validation of the American economic system. But if you look at if you remove the top 1% of people in both France and the United States, and look at the bottom 99%, what you'll see is that income for almost everyone in France has grown much more quickly than income for almost everyone in the United States. So it's not just aggregate growth that matters. You really need to think about the distribution. And what's happened to the distribution in the United States is that it's become more unequal than in any other developed country except for Chile. which has embraced free market policies even more wholeheartedly than the United States. And so that inequality, to me, is a real problem. Economists were aware that inequality would increase, but they said it didn't matter. They argued that inequality was relatively unimportant. So long as you were ending absolute poverty, you shouldn't worry about differences in income. And we've been conducting a natural experiment for several decades now, and we have a lot more data, and to our sorrow, what we've learned is that inequality really does matter in all sorts of concrete ways. Those who are disadvantaged not only experience disadvantage in much the same way that people experience poverty, but their ability to contribute to society is limited. So it's not just bad for them, it's bad for everyone. And there's one further consequence that I think is really important. When we talk about the political strains on our country, the reason that it's becoming hard to govern the United States, I think a big part of that is that we the people is a harder idea when we have less and less in common. And so our civic fabric is being strained by this growing inequality. It makes it harder to write policies that are actually good for everyone because our interests have grown so disparate. And this is a direct consequence of this inequality. So you have a half-century period, basically, in which economists are regularly telling policymakers not to make equality a goal of public policy. And the result is that we have a lot less of it.
So these are the problems. Do economists have a role to play in formulating the solutions? That is, can the folks who got us into this mess help get us out of this mess?
Yeah, you know, I still have some friends who are economists, and one of them asked me, you know, do you want me to go back to the basement? And I said, well, no, that's not the point here. I think we need better economists. I think economists absolutely have a role to play. They've been enormously constructive in helping us to think through policy decisions, in structuring policies, some of which have been enormously beneficial. The reason there's no more acid rain is that an economist figured out how to price it and made a market in it. Kidney transplants have massively increased because of an economist who built a marketplace for kidney transplants. There are wonderful things that economists can and do in society. I think the fundamental problem is that we not only employed economists in helping us to make policy decisions, but we took too seriously their views on what the goals of policy should be. And that's something that I think the political process needs to reclaim and to assert responsibility for. But there's no question that economists should be in the room.
So one final question, then we'll turn to all of you. I'm curious about the evolution of economics over time. So a lot of this book is drawn from examples from the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, as economists were emerging into the public space. The last 20 years have seen something of a revolution in the economic discipline. Behavioral economics and other moves have tried to think less rigidly in terms of models, to look back for empirical support in real-world observations for the economic modeling that economists do. And one potential response to the argument you're making is, yes, economists blundered very often in ignoring the consequences, but that's changing. It has changed, that you're writing about history and the present. These are problems that the present is already dealing with.
Yeah, it is a work of history, that should be clear, and it is true that economics is changing and in some promising directions. In particular, there's been an empirical revolution. The availability of larger and much finer-grained data sets is allowing economists to analyze human behavior much more precisely and in ways that are leading to new conclusions, including that economists have reconsidered the importance of inequality, and there's now a growing body of economic work showing just how bad inequality can be. So I think enormously exciting things are happening in economics. I think we're in a period, you know, in the 30s and again in the 70s, it was clear that our approach to economic policy had broken down. And there was a period of time in which it wasn't clear what was going to happen next. And I think we're in a decade like that again. It's clear that what we were doing isn't working. And it's clear that in the academy, there are a lot of exciting new directions. But for the most part, those new ways of thinking have not yet reshaped public policy. And so we're in a period where I think the key question is not, are economists doing better, but how do we begin to move some of those new approaches into public policy, to improve public policy, and frankly, to validate a direction in public policy that's different from the prevailing one, which is basically, let's ignore the technocrats, curl up in our turtle shell, and hope everyone else goes away.
So I'm actually going to go back my word there and ask one more question. back in the years before the financial crisis, you were a business reporter down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and reported on the mortgage industry, on mortgage fraud, reporting that was the runner-up for the Public Service Pulitzer and led to a variety of charges against the firms that were involved. That gave you a somewhat unusual background for a Federal Reserve reporter. You had been there at the ground level and seen the economic system as it was designed failing to operate. How large a role did living through that, writing those stories ahead of the crash, trying to tell people that something was badly broken and being told again and again that in fact this was the system working as it designed, how large a role did that play in spurring you to write this?
I think, it absolutely did. And I think, frankly, for all of us, having lived through that crisis was, an awakening. And I think many people came out of it feeling like what we were doing clearly had problems and flaws. For me, I was not, my degree is not in economics. And so, it's a discipline that I've learned a lot about, but didn't grow up in. And I think that makes a big difference. I think if you sort of come up in a world where, you're taught the basic assumptions and they become, sort of the writ and inform the way you move through the world, it can be harder to see what the problems are, harder to have the necessary critical distance. So I do think that, some of my perspective on this is certainly informed not only by my own experiences, but just, by being a bit of an outsider in the field.
Great. So hopefully we'll get questions from all of you. There are microphones circulating around.
Could you talk about some of the ideas circulating in the Academy that you think are exciting?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's not just idea. I mean, the work that's exciting is being done by people like, well, Raj Chetty is one of the most important. He's an economist who, I guess he's back at Harvard now, but he basically uses tax data and other large databases of financial information about Americans. And what he's been able to show is how much of a deterioration in opportunity there has been over time. So one of the amazing statistics from his work that I find very striking, our father, I usually say my father, but in this case our father, was born in 1953, and more than 3/4 of American men born in that year were making more than their own fathers by the age of 40. I was born in 1978, and less than half of American men were making more than their own fathers by the age of 40. So there's been this huge deterioration in opportunity. The idea of the American dream, the idea that you can get ahead of where your parents were, has really fallen by the wayside. And that, and then the question becomes, well, what do we do about it? And another thing that Chetty's work has really illuminated is the importance of communities and place. Kids who live in neighborhoods with strong schools, with good social services, they do much better in life. And so one of the things he's advocated for is the use of federal housing vouchers to distribute families more evenly through metropolitan areas so that more children from disadvantaged households have the opportunity to succeed in life. That's an example of sort of how you can translate academic economic work into a specific policy prescription.
It occurs to me that I've still got a year here, but to mess up Chetty's statistics, but it's already too late for you.
Good luck to you.
Over here?
Oh, yeah.
Great.
So there was a recent announcement from the Business Roundtable moving sort of a new direction for business, and the Financial Times and others jumped in very quickly to support it, and it's not new. So I was wondering if from a historical perspective you could comment on that shift and whether is it actually something you think will persist, or is it just sort of a fad?
Yeah, so just by way of background, Milton Friedman, to get back to that name again, wrote a very famous article in the New York Times in the early 1970s in which he argued that the sole responsibility of a corporation is to maximize its profits, to do as much as it can for its shareholders, and that everything else worked against that goal and should be discarded. And that became the dominant philosophy of American corporations. The idea was if you just tried to do as well as possible, that would be the best thing for society at large. The Business Roundtable, which is a leading business lobbying group, embraced that principle for a very long time, but it came out this summer and said, no, we've reconsidered. We actually think that corporations have an obligation to a broader set of stakeholders, including their employees, the communities in which they operate, the environment. So as such, that's a very positive thing. Bloomberg News sent out reporters to ask all of the corporations that signed that statement if they were changing anything, and they all said no. So I don't want to overstate the immediate importance of the shift in language, but conceptually it's a really important shift. It's something that needs to happen, and part of why it's happening is really interesting. There's been an enormously successful effort to mobilize large pools of investment funds, in particular pension funds, that are in theory serving the interests of, for example, California state workers or unions, and to say to them, your sole obligation is not to invest as successfully as possible. You need to be thinking about the companies that you're investing in. If you're a union pension fund and the company where you're putting your money is preventing unions from forming, that's not good enough. And if you're a fund that is meant to be providing pensions for the next century, and you're not thinking about global warming, that's not good enough. And that, there's been decades of debate about how you get these corporations to refocus. It turns out what you do is you get some of their largest shareholders to tell them they have to.
Hi. One huge area of economic thought and activity that you haven't mentioned yet is free trade and what we now see as globalization. Can you give us your thoughts on the trajectory of that over the past
So the
50
question is
years?
about free trade and globalization.
Yeah, absolutely. So free trade, the idea that nations benefit by opening their borders and exchanging goods, is the original economic idea. It's really where the modern field begins, is in Great Britain, in arguing for Great Britain to drop what was called mercantilism and to focus on free trade as the route to prosperity. That's the first great victory of economics as public policy. It's not a new idea, so it's not something that economists in America advocated for or invented, but it played obviously an important role in the American century. And after World War II in particular, America decided that free trade was in its interest and embraced it. Where I do think that economists were enormously important is in advocating the premise that as long as there was an aggregate benefit in trade, it didn't matter what the distributional consequences were. In theory, everybody could be better off. In practice, they never were. But there's a town called Salina, Ohio. It's where Huffy used to make bicycles, and there's a giant factory there where more than 1,000 people used to do that work. And that factory closed in the late 1990s, and its parking lot is now occupied by a Walmart supercenter. So the Huffy bicycles now come from China, and they're cheaper. So everyone in Salina, Ohio can buy bicycles more cheaply. But they don't have jobs anymore because those jobs are now in China. The benefit is broad but shallow. Everybody gets cheaper bikes. The cost is narrow but deep. Those people don't have jobs anymore. In aggregate, an economist will tell you that we're all better off because Huffy is now in China. But what needs to be thought about more, and where they failed to, I think where the government has failed, is in dealing with the specific plight of those workers. And that story, of course, has played out dozens of times across the country.
On this side, yes.
What do you think the odds are of America or the United States adopting some version of helicopter money?
So the question is about what's called helicopter money, which is the idea that a central bank can stimulate the economy essentially by dropping money on people or by giving money directly to people. Andrew Yang, of course, has campaigned on a version of this idea, his universal basic income proposal. Listen, there are forms of it that are already in place. The earned income tax credit is essentially a form of helicopter money. There are ways in which we've adopted this premise that the best thing government can do for people is to give them money. The question is about, how much of it you do, how many people you help that way, how much you give them, and those are appropriate subjects for political debate.
You think it'll ever happen?
What? Like everybody getting money from the government?
That would be a way to reduce some of the inequality.
I'm actually skeptical about I view UBI, Universal Basic Income, as a very pessimistic policy prescription. It seems to me that in the first place, ever since the invention of the plow, people have been losing their jobs to technology and finding new jobs. And I think there's good reason to expect that process to continue. I tend to think that it is better as a matter of policy to focus on policies that increase opportunity. Universal pre-kindergarten is a great example of that, that will enable people to get jobs rather than supporting them on the premise that there won't be enough jobs.
Do you think the through line for economists, the problems of the past and some of the improvements of the future follows the, I guess, improved ability to capture data or to quantify things that previously were not quantifiable? Does that make sense?
I think it's certainly true that having more data makes it possible to do more sophisticated economics, but I don't think that there's a straight line correlation between more data and better economics. A lot of what happened in the mid-century is that they got just enough data to be dangerous. So, for example, until the Great Depression, economists and the government, for that matter, had no idea how large the American economy was. No one knew how to measure it. And the Senate actually hires an economist in 1932 to do that for the first time. And the guy comes back and says, well, here's how large the economy is, and it used to be a lot bigger. And that is called GDP. That's the birth moment for gross domestic product as a concept. Once they have that data in hand, they get very excited. We can now measure economics, and they start, and one of the first conclusions that gets reached by the same guy who invented GDP is that as a society grows, inequality decreases. And his conclusion was based on about 20 years of data in the American mid-century, and it was true that after World War II, inequality decreased. Well, that was, a very interesting conclusion that turned out to be totally wrong, made possible by the fact that there was now more data in hand. So data can be great, but it depends on how you use it. Certainly at the moment, we're seeing, really a revolution in the availability of data and in our ability to process it, and I think that has great potential, but I wouldn't overstate the value of data as such.
Hold on, we're trying to go to the people with microphones. We'll come around to you. Yes?
Yeah, you talked about this town in Ohio that Walmart opened a store there. Why did they open a store in a town where nobody had jobs? That doesn't seem to be very smart.
Lots of people have jobs in that town, of course. What we know, though, is that the people who lose their jobs often suffer a lifetime loss of income. Their children end up, I think one of the scariest studies I've ever read is a study showing that periods of extended unemployment reduce lifetime earnings for the children of the people who are unemployed. So there's a lasting consequence. They also tend to die sooner. So the economy moves on, it does, and that's part of my answer on UBI is that, we know that over time people will find new lines of employment. Unemployment in Salina, Ohio today is actually not any higher than it was before Huffy left town. What is lower is the average wage that workers in that town make, and for a number of the individual people who worked in that factory, that was the end of their economically useful livelihood. So I don't think, it's not that prevent these kinds of transitions. What you want to be doing is thinking about how you make the transitions easier for those individual workers, because the fact that Salina as a whole is prospering today is not the same as saying that everybody who lived in Salina has prospered.
On this side?
Thanks. Could you extend the analysis on the globalization and free trade? So in the earlier answer, you talked about that town, but what about the Chinese and the global poor? Hasn't, during this period where you're indicting economists, hasn't the world been better off?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that free trade has spread prosperity across the globe and has lifted billions, literally billions of people out of absolute poverty. I don't think that was necessarily a project of economists. The rise of China was probably inevitable, and manufacturing has spread more evenly across the globe as a consequence, and that has undoubtedly been beneficial, and the support for free trade policies, again, has played a valuable role. And I want to be clear about this. The indictment is not that everything they did is bad. The indictment is that the revolution went too far. The indictment is that if you're going to support free trade policies, you have an obligation not only to justify it by saying that everyone could be better off, but by making sure that people are better off. And so the problem is not that the factory left Salina, but that the workers were unable to do so.
On this side?
One of the things that I was impressed with the young man's question over there put a damper on my expectation that quantum computers will give us better data. And you're saying that's not necessarily true. That's just an observation. My question is, the census that's due up for the next 10 years has economic implications. And we hear that there's a number of people that are not going to submit information to the census because they fear the consequences of revealing their existence in the United States. Do you see that as even more disparaging on especially the poor?
So this is a question about where the government gets its economic data and whether or not at this moment it might be getting some data that is less than accurate as people fear to respond to census questions.
Yeah, so I think, I guess generally what I'd say is that The quality of the data that we rely on, when you get under the hood, often involves a lot of assumptions, a lot of filling in gaps. When they come out and report GDP for the first time, a significant chunk of it is just a projection that the economy has continued to grow at the same rate as it was growing previously. And one of the reasons that the revisions often change the reported number is that we start to get better information over time, and we can replace assumptions with actual information. This is a way of saying that, like, we're always grappling with these questions. The exact form of the limitations can change, and in this case, you know, there's a lot of concern that we'll see an underreporting of immigrant populations in the next census, and that has real policy consequences that people are grappling with. But there are always pressures of different kinds on the quality of the data. Part of the work of economics is to overcome those limitations to produce meaningful and useful data. I do think, by the way, that it gets easier with computing power. I just don't think it's a complete solution. But these are always challenges and probably things that don't get talked about enough.
So as you're, the story that you're telling is about a political system that ends up getting supported by a certain kind of academic expertise and infrastructure. I'm curious, if you were to be a bit prescriptive, what alternative infrastructure you could see supporting the political system that could help it focus on these ends-based questions more effectively?
Yeah, again, so I'm not sure that the problem is necessarily the infrastructure, it's the way that it's being used. So the concern is that if you are displacing to economists the decisions about the ends of the policymaking process, if, for example, you want to pretend that economists will give you objective answers on the value of human life, and to treat it as a discussion that should only happen among scientists, what you end up with is a situation in which, and this is true, during the George W. Bush administration, the government reduces the value of human life, and then Obama comes into office and the value of human life is increased. And the scientists all pretend that they're just engaged in science and, you know, they just reach different conclusions. No. What's happening there is that politics are happening by another name, and we'd all be better off if politicians were explicit about that fact and said, listen, what's called the statistical value of life is a really important concept in our democracy. We make all sorts of decisions on its basis. It ought to be something that we are aware of as a people and that we're talking about as a people. And yes, methodology bounds the possible range of outcomes, but, you know, so for example, the Bush administration basically advanced an argument that the lives of old people were worth less money because they were going to die sooner. The Obama administration, by contrast, advanced an argument that it was better to prevent that deaths from cancer should be treated as more expensive because they were more painful. These are both plausible arguments on some level, but they're political arguments too. They were basically ways of saying we want to move the number. And to dress that up as if it were pure science is to displace the role of politics and to allow technocrats to decide too much.
So for a related question, economists generally tend to undervalue the value that infrastructure provides. Do you think that the lack of public investment in infrastructure is related to the Economists Hour?
I absolutely do. I think disinvestment in general. You know, I think, you know, a lot of people celebrate the 1990s as the last time that the economy was really prospering and doing well. The part of that story that doesn't get told is that our prosperity in the 1990s was built on massive public investment in earlier decades. We entered the 1990s with the most educated workforce in the developed world. We'd made massive investments in infrastructure and in research and development, which had created a technology infrastructure that was second to none, and we took advantage of that. But what we stopped doing during that same period was making new investments. And so we entered the current decade with a workforce that's below average in terms of education in the developed world, with roads and bridges and, you know, everything else that's crumbling, with much less government spending on basic research as a share of GDP. And so what you basically have is a situation in which we're reaping the fruits of that. People look around and say, well, why is the economy growing more slowly? Well, I'm not sure it's that big a mystery. And that is a direct consequence of the Economists Hour. It's a direct focus in two ways. The first is the premise that government intervenes in markets and makes them worse, rather than understanding that governments are both constitutive of markets, necessary for their proper function, and have an important role to play in investing in ways that lay the seeds for future growth. And second, you know, this overwhelming emphasis on the short term, this sense of measuring results in the here and now, which makes it much harder to justify long-term investments.
We've got time, I think, for one more question here.
Thank you. Broad question. What are your thoughts on cryptocurrency, and do you think it's a threat to our current financial system.
I sort of watch it with wonder. To get a handle on it, I bought $10 of Bitcoin close to the peak last year. I think it's worth about 4 now, something like that. So my thoughts are that I've lost a little bit of money on Bitcoin.
Fabulous. Well, we could obviously extend this session indefinitely. The good news is that you can read the rest of it, that there are signed copies of the book available in the back. And I want to thank all of you for coming out today and hearing us chat.
Thank you to Binya and Yoni. This afternoon, we've got a handful of programs on the calendar: race and justice, small business, wellness, and beyond science. And later tonight, a special event with Pop-Up Magazine. You won't want to miss it. Thank you.